It's time for Fresh Oil with singer-songwriter and pastor Keith Manley, a program designed to minister the gospel of God's grace and to bring fresh oil to the brokenhearted. And now, with today's program, Pastor Keith Manley.
Welcome to Fresh Oil. I'm Keith Manley. Thank you for joining me today. Yesterday, we began a new series, God Uses Broken People. We discovered that God's pattern throughout Scripture is not to choose the qualified. He chooses broken people, flawed people, weak people, people who often feel completely unworthy of being used. Today, we come to one of the greatest examples of that truth in all of the Bible. His name is Moses. When most people think of Moses, they think of the Red Sea, the Ten Commandments, the burning bush, the Exodus, the great deliverer of Israel. But before Moses became a deliverer, Moses was a fugitive. Before Moses became a leader, Moses was a failure. Before Moses became a prophet, Moses was a murderer. And perhaps that's why his story gives hope to so many of us. Because if God could use Moses, he can use anybody. When we first meet Moses, everything seems to be going his way. He is raised in Pharaoh's palace. He receives the best education in Egypt. He has privilege, influence, opportunity. The book of Acts tells us he was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt and was powerful in speech and action. Think about that. Moses had everything the world says a successful leader needs: position, education, connections, influence. If anyone looked qualified, it was Moses. But God was about to teach him something that all of us eventually learn. Your greatest qualification is not your talent. It is your dependence upon God. One day Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Anger filled his heart. Looking both ways, Moses struck the Egyptian and killed him. Then he buried the body in the sand. Perhaps Moses thought nobody would ever know. Perhaps he thought the secret would remain buried. But secrets have a way of surfacing. The next day, Moses tried to intervene in another conflict. And one of the Hebrews looked at him and asked, "Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" Suddenly, Moses realized his secret was exposed. Pharaoh heard about it, and Moses ran. The prince became a fugitive. The man who grew up in a palace found himself alone in a desert. The man who seemed destined for greatness disappeared into obscurity for 40 years. Think about that. 40 years. Most of us don't like waiting 40 days. Moses waited 40 years. 40 years tending sheep. 40 years in Midian. 40 years wondering what happened to his life. Have you ever experienced a season like that? Maybe not 40 years, but a season when life didn't go according to plan. A season where your dreams seemed buried. A season where you wondered if God had forgotten you. Moses understood those feelings. The man who once seemed destined for greatness now spent his days walking behind sheep. Nothing glamorous, nothing exciting, nothing impressive, just ordinary life, day after day, year after year. But here's what Moses didn't understand. The desert was not punishment. The desert was preparation. Sometimes God takes us into seasons we would never choose because He is preparing us for assignments we cannot yet see. The palace had taught Moses how to be somebody. The desert was teaching Moses how to depend on God. And there is a huge difference. The palace gave him confidence in himself. The desert taught him confidence in God. The palace gave him position. The desert gave him humility. The palace taught him leadership. The desert taught him surrender. Friends, some of the most important work God does in our lives happens in hidden seasons. Seasons nobody applauds. Seasons nobody notices. Seasons that seem ordinary. But God is doing something beneath the surface. One day, after 40 years in the wilderness, Moses noticed something unusual. A bush was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. The bush burned, yet it remained intact. Moses turned aside to investigate, and suddenly God spoke. "Moses, Moses." Can you imagine that moment? 40 years of silence. 40 years of obscurity. 40 years of ordinary life. And now God speaks. What happened next may be one of the most encouraging conversations in Scripture, because Moses immediately begins explaining to God why he has chosen the wrong person. Have you ever done that? God speaks and we start arguing. God calls and we start listing reasons it won't work. That's exactly what Moses did. God says, "I'm sending you to Pharaoh." Moses says, "Who am I?" God answers. Moses gives another excuse. "What if they don't believe me?" God answers. Moses gives another excuse. "I am slow of speech and tongue." God answers. Moses gives another excuse. "Please send someone else." 5 times Moses argues. 5 times he explains why he's unqualified. 5 times he points to his weaknesses. And God answers every objection. I love that. God doesn't abandon the conversation. He doesn't say, "Fine, I'll find somebody else." Instead, he patiently addresses every fear, every excuse, every insecurity. Why? Because God already knew all of Moses' weaknesses before he called him. None of them surprised him. One of the most fascinating parts of the story is Moses' statement, "I am slow of speech and tongue." Many scholars believe Moses had some type of speech impediment, perhaps a stutter, perhaps some other difficulty. Whatever it was, Moses viewed it as a major limitation. In his mind, it disqualified him. After all, how could a man with a speech problem stand before Pharaoh? How could a man who struggled with words become God's spokesman? It didn't make sense. Yet listen carefully to God's response. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. What an answer. God did not deny Moses' weakness. He redirected Moses' focus. Moses was looking at his limitations. God was looking at his power. Moses was focused on his inability. God was focused on his presence. Friend, that's a lesson every believer needs to learn. The question is never, what am I capable of? The real question is, what is God capable of? Too many people spend their lives staring at their limitations. I don't have enough education. I don't have enough talent. I don't have enough experience. I'm too old. I'm too young. I've made too many mistakes. I've failed too many times. Meanwhile, God is saying, I know all of that. I knew it before I called you. I am not depending on your strength. The greatest obstacle to God's purpose is often not our weakness, it's our obsession with our weakness. Moses thought his speech problem was the issue. It wasn't. The issue was whether he would trust God. Think about it. The very thing Moses considered a liability may have been one of God's greatest tools. A man who speaks effortlessly may trust his own ability. A man who knows his weakness must depend on God. Perhaps the stutter kept Moses dependent. Perhaps it reminded him continually that this assignment required divine help, and that's exactly where God wanted him. Eventually, Moses obeyed, not perfectly, not confidently, but obediently, and that is important. Sometimes we imagine heroes of faith charging forward without fear. That wasn't Moses. In fact, throughout his story, we continue seeing moments of uncertainty, moments of weakness, moments of frustration, moments of fear. Yet God used him anyway. One of my favorite observations from this chapter is this: God was not looking for a man who was enough. He was looking for a man who knew he wasn't. Think about that. God often chooses people who understand their need for Him, because those people leave room for grace. Those people leave room for God's power. Those people leave room for miracles. Eventually, Moses stood before Pharaoh, the same Pharaoh he once feared, the same power he once ran from, the same empire that once seemed unstoppable. And Moses declared, "Let my people go." What changed? Moses changed. Not because he became stronger, not because he became more talented, not because he became more eloquent. He changed because he learned that God's presence was enough. Remember what God promised him at the burning bush? "I will be with you." That was the answer. Not greater confidence, not greater ability, not greater qualifications, just God's presence. And that is still the answer today. When God calls us, He doesn't promise we'll have all the answers. He doesn't promise we'll never feel weak. He doesn't promise we'll never struggle. He promises His presence. "I will be with you." The murderer became the deliverer. The fugitive became the leader. The stutterer became the spokesman. Not because Moses fixed himself, because God used him exactly where he was. And maybe that's what somebody listening today needs to hear. Perhaps you've spent years focused on your failures, your regrets, your weaknesses, your mistakes. Like Moses, you've convinced yourself you're disqualified. But God specializes in using people who feel unqualified. Your weakness doesn't surprise Him. Your past doesn't intimidate Him. Your failures don't disqualify you. In fact, they may become part of your testimony. As we close today's program, I want to remind you of something. The desert was not the end of Moses' story. The murder was not the end of Moses' story. The stutter was not the end of Moses' story. And whatever you're facing today is not the end of your story either.
Thanks for joining us today for Fresh Oil with Pastor Keith Manley. Fresh Oil is an outreach of Grace Family Church in Rockford, Illinois, and can be heard each weekday at this same time. You can reach us online at weneedgod.com. Until next time, remember, God's love for you is unconditional, and He makes His mercies new every morning.